What if the Wright brothers were 3,000 years late? What if the sonic booms we hear today are just echoes of engines that roared before the first pyramid was ever sketched in the sand? We are taught that human history is a linear progression from stone tools to bronze swords, from horse-drawn carts to internal combustion engines. We are told that flight is a miracle of the 20th century, a triumph of modern engineering that separates us from our primitive ancestors. But there is a crack in that narrative, a crack filled with impossible artifacts, inexplicable radioactive ruins, and text so technically precise they shouldn't exist. Welcome to the uncomfortable reality of the Vimanas. These aren't metaphors. These aren't poetic descriptions of gods riding on clouds. These are nuts and bolts machines described with the kind of engineering detail that makes a modern aerospace manual look vague. We are talking about aerodynamics, propulsion systems based on mercury vortices, and weapon guidance systems that lock onto sound. The ancient Sanskrit texts date back to the 15th century BC, yet they describe technologies that the Soviet Union and the United States were desperately trying to reverse engineer in the 1960s. This isn't a story about mythology. This is an investigation into a lost epic of high technology, an epic that ended in fire and radiation, leaving us to crawl out of the ashes and reinvent the wheel, arrogant enough to think we were the first to touch the sky. Today, we peel back the layers of translation errors and academic suppression to look at the blueprints of the gods. And we ask the most dangerous question of all. Did we invent the rocket, or did we just rediscover it? The Vedas. To the uninitiated, they are religious scriptures, chants, hymns to the divine. But when you strip away the ritualistic chanting and look at the core descriptions, you find something that chills the blood of a historian. The Rig Veda, the oldest of them all, doesn't just talk about chariots. It describes mechanical birds that require fuel. It speaks of craft that can jump from the surface of the earth into the deep void of space. We are looking at descriptions from 1500 BC, at the very least, that understand the concept of atmospheric layers. Consider the terminology. The texts use words that have no business existing in the Bronze Age. They distinguish between mantrika, flight by mantra or vibration, and tantrika, flight by mechanical means. They describe craft that are self-moving and sky-traveling. The Mahabharata, the great Indian epic, is often dismissed as fantasy literature. But read the descriptions of the Vimanas used in the Kurukshetra war. They aren't magical floating carpets. They are metallic. They reflect the sun. They have engines that make a roar like a lion before takeoff. Skeptics love to say these are just creative writing. But creative writing usually relies on the known world. A Bronze Age farmer can imagine a flying horse because he knows horses and he knows birds. He cannot imagine a cylindrical craft made of specific alloys that uses a mercury propulsion system to generate lift, unless he has seen it or possesses the technical manual. The writers of the Vedas weren't poets. In this context, they were war correspondents documenting technology they saw but couldn't fully replicate. They were witnesses to a science we have forgotten. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. The Vaimanika Shastra. This is the document that keeps aeronautical engineers awake at night. Rediscovered, or perhaps revealed, in the early 20th century, it claims to be a channeled transcription of an ancient sage, Bharadwaja. Academics dismiss it because of its provenance. But look at the content. It doesn't discuss morality or the soul. It discusses metallurgy. It lists 31 distinct parts of a flying machine. It describes clothing for pilots, clothing that is heat-resistant and shock-absorbing. The text categorizes Vimanas into 4 main types: Shakuna, Sundara, Rukma, and Tripura. The Rukma Vimana is described as conical, gold-colored, with 3 tiers. The Tripura is a massive craft that can operate on land, under the sea, and in the air. This isn't fantasy. This is a multi-domain military vehicle classification system. The text even details the specific types of mirrors and lenses needed on the exterior of the craft. Pendula mirrors to protect the pilot's eyes from evil rays, which sounds suspiciously like laser shielding or radiation protection. It goes deeper. The text describes yantras, machines or mechanisms inside the craft. It mentions a Guha Garbha mirror, which can detect energy from enemy craft. It talks about mechanism for expanding and contracting the craft size. Variable geometry wings, anyone? It even lists the specific melting points of the alloys used for the hull. Why would a mystic text from India care about the melting point of metals, unless it was a manual for construction? The level of detail implies a supply chain, a manufacturing standard, and an industrial base that has completely vanished from the archaeological record. Propulsion. This is where the ancient texts stop sounding like mythology and start sounding like NASA theoretical papers. The Samarangana Sutradhara, a treatise on architecture and engineering, dedicates over 200 verses to the construction of the manas. It explicitly states, inside the circular airframe, place the mercury engine with its solar mercury boiler at the aircraft center. Read that again. Mercury engine. The text continues. By means of the power latent in the mercury, which sets the driving whirlwind in motion, a man sitting inside may travel a great distance in the sky. A driving whirlwind. In modern physics, we call this a mercury vortex engine. The concept is that spinning heated mercury can create a powerful electromagnetic field, potentially interacting with gravity itself. It's theoretical anti-gravity. NASA and other agencies experimented with ion engines and mercury propellants in the 1960s and 70s. The ancients weren't burning coal. They weren't using steam. They were describing a closed-loop system using a heavy liquid metal to generate thrust or lift. The texts warn that the knowledge is kept secret, not for lack of knowledge, but to prevent misuse. They knew that this technology, in the wrong hands, ends civilizations. And looking at the scorch marks of history, it seems they were right. The mercury connection is the smoking gun. It's too specific, too scientifically viable in a theoretical sense to be a random guess by a guy in a loincloth 3,000 years ago. The 1960s. The Cold War is at its freezing peak. The space race is consuming the GDP of 2 superpowers, and quietly, in the shadows of the Kremlin, Soviet scientists are turning their eyes toward India. This is the twist that most history books ignore. The Soviet Union didn't just want to build rockets. They wanted to know if someone had beaten them to it by a few millennia. Reports surfaced, fragmented, redacted, that Soviet researchers were actively studying the Rig Veda and the Vimana Shastra. Why? Because the Soviets were pragmatic. They didn't care about the religious implications. They cared about the weaponizable data. If a text describes a fuel source that doesn't require massive chemical tanks, the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, wants that blueprint. It is documented that Dr. A.V. Krishnamurti, a professor of aeronautics at the Indian Institute of Science, admitted that the Vedas discuss aerodynamics in a way that aligns with modern understanding. The Soviets were listening. There is a distinct correlation between the intense study of these texts in the 60s and the sudden leaps in aerospace technology during that decade. We attribute it all to German scientists from Operation Paperclip, but was that the only source? The Soviets were obsessed with ancient astronaut theories, not as sci-fi, but as archaeological intelligence gathering. They were looking for the Vimana drive. Did they find it? Maybe the breakdown of the Soviet Union buried those files deep in the archives of the FSB, but the timeline of their interest matches perfectly with the acceleration of the arms race. Let's talk about the weapons. The Vimanas weren't just transport, they were gunships. The text described the Agneya weapon, a blazing missile that possessed the brilliance of 10,000 suns. It didn't just explode, it enveloped the enemy in a smokeless fire. The Mahabharata describes the aftermath of this weapon: hair and nails falling out, pottery breaking without cause, birds turning white, food becoming poisoned. If you are a doctor or a physicist, you know exactly what those symptoms are. That is acute radiation sickness. Hair loss, nail detachment, contaminated food supply. The texts are describing nuclear fallout with clinical precision, thousands of years before the Manhattan Project. They speak of the Brahmastra, a weapon so terrible that its use was forbidden except in the most dire circumstances, because it would dry up the rains and cause infertility in the land for generations. Then there are the sound-seeking weapons. The texts mention projectiles that could follow a specific sound to its source. Acoustic homing missiles. In 1500 BC, how does a civilization that supposedly only had bows and arrows conceptualize a missile that locks onto an audio frequency? The cognitive dissonance required to dismiss this as fantasy is staggering. These aren't metaphors for lightning bolts. These are technical descriptions of guided munitions and tactical nukes. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. One of the oldest cities in the world. When archaeologists excavated it, they found something that shouldn't be there. Skeletons lying in the streets, holding hands, struck down in an instant. No signs of sword wounds, no signs of struggle. Just sudden, instant death. And the radiation levels? When examined, some of these skeletons were 50 times more radioactive than the natural background level. The city also contains evidence of vitrification, stone fused into glass. This phenomenon, known as trinitite, only occurs under extreme heat, the kind of heat generated by a nuclear explosion. You find it at the Trinity test site in New Mexico. You find it at Hiroshima. And you find it in the ruins of the Indus Valley civilization. The ancient texts say the Vimanas rained down destruction. The archaeology shows cities turned to glass and radioactive skeletons. Connect the dots. We are looking at a crime scene that is 4,000 years old. The Vimanas weren't just vehicles. They were the delivery systems for a holocaust that wiped an advanced era off the map, leaving only terrified survivors to pass down stories of gods warring in the sky. The sound-seeking technology deserves a closer look. The manuscript speaks of Shabdavedi, targeting by sound. In modern warfare, we use acoustic locators to find sniper fire or artillery. We use sonar. But the idea of a projectile that adjusts its flight path based on audio input is sophisticated cybernetics. The text also describes stealth capabilities. The Antardana secret, techniques to make the Vimana invisible, or Paroksha, to make the Vimana appear like a cloud. We spent billions developing the F-117 Nighthawk and the B-2 Spirit to achieve radar invisibility and visual obfuscation. The ancient manuals list this as a standard feature. They even discuss Gudha, the ability to intercept and listen to the conversations of enemy pilots in other Vimanas. Electronic warfare, signals intelligence. If these were just stories, why focus on the interception of communications? Why focus on camouflage? Heroes in myths usually want to be seen. They glow, they shout. They don't activate cloaking devices and monitor radio frequencies. These details betray a military mindset, a tactical doctrine that is eerily modern. It suggests that the skies of ancient India were a contested airspace, a zone of dogfights and electronic countermeasures. The energy source: fire and water. The texts are cryptic but suggestive. Some interpretations of the propulsion systems suggest a form of hydrolysis, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen for fuel, or using steam as a reaction mass in a nuclear thermal engine. The Rasa engines utilizing mercury are the most cited, but the mention of water as a power source brings to mind cold fusion or advanced hydrogen cells. The Suryamani crystal is mentioned as a device to capture solar energy. Solar panels? Or something more potent, like a solar concentrator that beams power directly to the engine. The texts say this crystal could also be used to burn enemy craft, a directed energy weapon, a laser. We are currently testing ship-mounted lasers to shoot down drones. We are testing hydrogen fuel cells. We are experimenting with plasma engines. Every breakthrough we announce on the evening news seems to have a counterpart in a Sanskrit verse. It forces us to ask, is scientific progress a straight line, or is it a circle? Are we climbing a mountain, or just digging up the ruins of the last climbers who fell off? The connection to Nazi Germany. It is a known historical fact that the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi Ancestral Heritage Organization, sent expeditions to Tibet and India in the 1930s. They were hunting for the origins of the Aryan race, but they were also hunting for occult power. Rumors have persisted for decades that they recovered Sanskrit manuscripts. Then came Die Glocke, the bell, a purported top-secret Nazi project involving a bell-shaped craft that used a spinning, purple liquid metal called Zerum 525. It sounds exactly like the mercury vortex engine described in the Vedic texts. The bell supposedly emitted high radiation, levitated, and caused crystallization in animal tissue. Did the Nazis find a translation of the Vimana manuals? Did they try to build one? The similarities between the described function of the Nazi bell and the Rukma Vimana are too close for comfort. And where did that technology go? Operation Paperclip took the scientists to the US. The Soviets took the labs to the East. The Vimana technology might have been the secret prize of World War II, a blueprint for the UFOs people started seeing in 1947. Space travel. The texts don't limit the Vimanas to the atmosphere. They speak of Surya Mandala, the solar region, and Nakshatra Mandala, the stellar region. They mention the need to protect the craft and occupants from the wind of space, solar wind, cosmic rays. The concept of the Akash Nahar, a corridor in the sky. This sounds like a flight path or a wormhole. The descriptions of the view from space, seeing the Earth as a globe, seeing the oceans as small pools, are accurate. How does a Bronze Age scribe know what the continents look like from orbit? Unless someone actually went there. The narrative of the Vimanas suggests an interplanetary civilization, one that perhaps didn't originate on Earth, or one that had colonies elsewhere. The Tripura Vimana's ability to go underwater and into space suggests a trans-medium vehicle, something the US Navy is currently baffled by in the Tic Tac UFO encounters. The capabilities match perfectly the suppression. Why isn't this taught in universities? Why is this relegated to ancient aliens shows on late-night TV? Because it breaks the model. If you admit the Vimanas were real, you have to admit that human civilization is much older and was much more advanced than we accept. You have to rewrite geology, archaeology, and theology. Institutions hate rewriting textbooks. It's expensive and it's embarrassing. It's easier to label the descriptions of Mercury engines as religious symbolism than to admit that a priest in 1500 BC knew more about propulsion than a Victorian engineer. The cognitive bias of chronological snobbery, the belief that we are the smartest people who ever lived, blinds academia to the evidence. But the evidence remains. The texts are there. You can download the Vimanaka Shastra today. You can read the Mahabharata. The blueprints are open source. The only thing missing is the industrial capacity to build them exactly as described, because we might still be missing the key component, the specific processing of the mercury, or the exact composition of the alloys, the pilot's manual. The texts detail the diet of the pilot, specific milks and roots to maintain focus and resist G-forces. They detail the clothing. They detail the training. A pilot had to know 32 secrets of the Vimana before being allowed to fly. These included mantrika, mantra invocation, tantrika, rituals, and kritika, mechanical handling. This wasn't a joyride. It was a rigorous military discipline. The secrets included how to switch propulsion modes, how to deploy decoys, how to destroy the craft if captured. This is a protocol, a standard operating procedure. The existence of a training curriculum implies a flight school. It implies infrastructure, hangars, mechanics, fuel depots. You don't have a fighter jet without a massive support system. Where are the hangars? Perhaps buried under the shifting sands of the Thar Desert, or perhaps as some theories suggest, under the ice of Antarctica, where the Nazis allegedly tried to set up their base. The psychological warfare. The texts mention weapons that cause fear, that cause panic, that cause the enemy to lose consciousness. San Mohana, a weapon causing stupor. We research non-lethal weapons today. ADS, active denial systems, sonic weapons, microwave emitters. The Vimanas were equipped for total dominance, not just physical destruction, but mental subjugation. The wars described in the epics weren't tribal skirmishes. They were high-tech conflicts involving psychological operations. The gods, fighting in the skies, were using tech that would make a CIA psyop look amateur. Modern India's stance. For a long time, Indian scientists were hesitant to embrace these texts, fearing ridicule from the West. But that is changing. In recent years, papers have been presented at the Indian Science Congress discussing the engineering feasibility of Vimanas. There is a growing movement to reclaim this scientific heritage. It's not about national pride, it's about forensic engineering. If the Mercury engine is viable, it solves our energy crisis. If the alloys are real, they solve our material science limits. The stigma is fading because the need for breakthrough tech is growing. The Great Filter. If they had spaceships and nukes, where did they go? The Fermi paradox applies to history, too. The answer is likely in the weapons themselves. The Brahmastra. The fallout. They destroyed themselves. The Vimanas represent the pinnacle of a civilization that flew too close to the sun. They reached the atomic age, and like us, they couldn't handle the power. The texts are not just manuals, they are warning labels. Do not push this button. We pushed it in 1945. We are pushing it again now. The Soviet legacy. Let's go back to the 1960s Soviet interest. What if the rapid development of the Soyuz program, the sudden prowess in metallurgy that the Soviets displayed, titanium hulls for Alpha-class submarines that the US couldn't match? What if that came from the Vedas? The Soviets were materialists. They didn't believe in magic. If they studied the Vedas, they found physics. The space race might have been a cover for a time race, a race to decode the past. The KGB files on this are likely the most heavily guarded secrets in Moscow. The skeptics' defense. They say, if they had flying machines, why did they ride horses? We have stealth bombers, but people in Afghanistan still ride donkeys. Technology is never evenly distributed. The Vimanas were likely the property of the elite, the ruling caste, the gods. The common man lived in the dirt, while the elite touched the stars. This stratification explains the lack of mass production evidence. These were Ferraris in a world of ox carts. Rare, precious. And when the civilization collapsed, the high tech was the first to be looted or destroyed. The sound. The hum. Many UFO witnesses describe a low-frequency hum. The Vimana texts describe a specific sound generated by the propulsion. Is the modern UFO phenomenon actually a glimpse of ancient tech that survived? Or tech that was reverse engineered by shadow governments? The link between the Sanskrit descriptions and modern sightings is too consistent. The lights, the silence, or the hum, the sudden acceleration. We are seeing the ghost of the Vedic age flying over our nuclear silos. So, what are we looking at? A myth, a lie, or a memory? The Vimanas challenge our timeline. They tell us that we are not the first. They tell us that the sky was conquered long before Kitty Hawk. The texts are there, defiant in their detail. The mercury engines are waiting to be built. The radiation at Mohenjo-Daro is still ticking on the Geiger counters. We can close our eyes and call it folklore, or we can open them and realize that the history of humanity is a cycle of rising, flying, and burning. The Vimanas are the evidence that we have been here before. And unless we learn from the manuals of the past, not just the flight mechanics, but the warnings of destruction, we are destined to become just another layer of radioactive dust for the next civilization to puzzle over. The blueprints are in our hands. The choice is ours.